Good evening and welcome to tonight's meeting. Our topic is the U.S. war in Syria, what's at stake? And we really have an excellent panel tonight to address that from several different perspectives. I'm Sara Flounders from the International Action Center, and I say welcome. Well, we are meeting at a time when there's kind of an international reality show underway, except it's happening in real time. I'm talking about Edward Snowden on the run. And not only here in this room, but this is a situation where the whole world literally is rooting for him. I mean, there are billions of people who are watching this, who are hooked to this. And you have the U.S. government making dire threats on China and then Russia, and how dare Ecuador, we can squeeze you, we can cut off your trade, threats on Cuba, don't you dare receive him, and so on and so forth. And it's important to recognize that the whole world is very much enjoying, at this point, thumbing their nose at an absolutely arrogant superpower. And there's outrage at the revelations, something we all know well, but of every phone call, every email, every cable, every possible transaction in the hands of a government that is making war on the world. Now, you'd wonder how that connects to tonight's meeting, and why, when you look at the rage, for example, of WikiLeaks and its revelations. Now, just a couple of years ago, the Washington Post, actually April 18th, 2011, wrote a rather detailed article on the U.S. funding of the Syrian opposition, and it was based on WikiLeaks cables from April of 2009. So that really shows this goes back a little ways before even the outbreak of the military struggle underway, that the support and the plan for building an opposition with U.S. funds was very much in place long before. And our speakers tonight will also look at the policies, at the sanctions, at the weapons flowing in, and so on. But to open our program, our first speaker, Dr. Guias Musa, is the Director of Communications for the Syrian American Forum. He is a longtime activist within the Arab American community and friends, and when he finds some spare time, he's a cardiologist in New Jersey. Now, as I say, he's very much a longtime activist with the Syrian American Forum, which is an organization that advocates rejection of violence and foreign military intervention in Syria. The Syrian American Forum calls for dialogue among all Syrians in order to end this conflict and preserve the sovereignty, territorial integrity, unity, and plurality of secular Syrian society. The Syrian American Forum has worked extensively in the U.S. on different levels and beyond to explain the true nature of this international campaign against Syria, the state, and to promote dialogue based on the Geneva Declaration of June 2012. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Guias Musa.
Thank you very much. You can manage, or?
Yes.
I'm happy and excited to be among all of you. It's really a pleasure. We've been working in trying to stop the U.S. government from supporting the rebels for a while, and now we're happy to see that we have friends that we can join hands together and we can hopefully get somewhere together. Thank you. We think that the administration decision to arm the rebel is really short-sighted, but why? The first reason, and probably the most important reason, the rebels on the ground are not the people that you can trust. The American government speaks about some moderate and some extremists. On the ground, we don't see anybody except the extremists. Maybe those moderates are those people that sit in hotels in Turkey and somewhere else. Nevertheless, on the ground, we only see extremists that kill, and we only see the Islamist appearing in here and in there that think of Islam as a way of using a religion to get themselves into power. They don't have anything to do with Islam whatsoever, because Islam is way nicer than this and way peaceful, more peaceful, and most importantly, they don't allow killing like this. From the other point of view, from the American point of view, from the start, the American government was helping the rebels, and like Sara said, from 2009 they started thinking and supporting people to topple the regime in Syria. Now, they could think about toppling a regime, although it's internationally illegal, but nevertheless, they're doing it with weapons, and that's definitely wrong, and that's what we're trying to stop, because it's not about who's in charge in there. What we want is to stop the killing. War is never a solution. On the other hand, what we see on the ground, that the government forces are gaining ground, and unfortunately, our warmongers in here, they think that this is probably a victory for Iran and Russia, and this is why they are all up in arms, and they want to arm people to try to do something about it, and that's even worse. In conclusion, we don't think that the public announcement that the United States is involving themselves in the conflict in there is something new, but we think and we know that they know very well that their friends are not about to win. We know that they're arming their friends so they would last more, so there will be more destruction for Syrian infrastructure and society in general. On the other hand, what would the Israeli attack or the role of the Israelis in the conflict? We see that the armed rebels are concentrating on targets that the Israelis are concentrating on, and namely the air defense of the Syrian army, namely the airports, the long-range missiles, the depots of weapons and communication centers. And on the other hand, the Israelis takes fighters that are wounded, they go and treat them and bring them back. And the statements of the Israeli government's always in conflict. They want the Assad sometimes, they want the rebels sometimes. All of it speaks highly that they are involved, they want the destruction of Syria, and that's again what we're trying to stop. Even the call for no-fly zone from our esteemed government, obviously it's not the answer, and obviously if they were able to do it, they would have done it from before. Obviously there is some power to the Syrian army, and there will be some obstacles and there will be some blood, and obviously we don't want that. And obviously there is some international uprisings going somewhere that hopefully we can build on it so we can stop this ugly war. Now, is the recent announcement a prelude for action from the United States government? We have a lot of reason to think that the American government is not ready to go involve itself militarily in Syria, but we have to qualify that by saying so far. Nevertheless, the decision to announce it in the open, the decision to plan for a no-fly zone, the training of the armed elements in the neighbors of countries, and the continued provision of communication equipment or the non-lethal equipment, all of it speaks highly that this is a prelude, and probably they are ready when time comes that they're going to go whenever they feel that Israel's security is at stake, they will go and involve themselves. Let me say by the end that we think that the awareness of the American public is the most important thing. And we all have to work together to make everybody understand that we think as the American public, we can stop this agony. We should stop the administration from that dragging us to this meaningless set of wars and death. Now I'm going to take you for a few slides to show you, since I am a doctor and I'm a physician that graduated from the University of Damascus in Syria, and I have some background about the way things were then and the way they are now. Bear with me, I'm going to give you a lot of numbers, and basically the numbers are from the World Health Organization. It's going to show you a few examples about what did the sanction do, the so-called sanction that we're trying to minimize the effect of the regime in Syria. How does it affect the public? Let me start saying that prior to the war, I don't know if you guys can read from the back. We can make it
Someone
bigger.
want to turn down the light just a little bit? Just a little, not all of them, just one of them. that good?
Bad? Oh. So put it back. It's okay.
Oh, okay.
The healthcare in Syria prior to the sanction was definitely a very strong system. First, all education were free. I became a doctor for 7 years in college and in medical school. I paid maybe $100 in total. And it's not a mediocre kind of doctor. I am an assistant professor in cardiology in the New Jersey State College in Newark and in Seton Hall University. I'm a teacher, and in the state of New Jersey, we have 900 physicians that are graduate from the University of Damascus, and all of it for free. We have dentistry, nursing, pharmacists, all of them are educated for free. All of medical care is free, and it's public, available for everybody. There are centers, the government made sure that every 10,000 person, they will have a center that have a doctor and a nurse and a little urgent center in every little village. In addition, cancer treatment is free for all, diabetes treatment is free for all, TB treatment is free for all. It's available everywhere until recently, obviously. This is to give you an idea about where are we in numbers. In Syria, for every 10,000 person, we have 15 physicians, 7 dentists, 8.4 pharmacists. You can read the numbers. 15 beds, like I said, that's center for every 10,000. And these are statistics from the Ministry of Health. As compared to our statistics, and that's in 2010 in Syria, our statistics in 2010, in the United States, we have a doctor for every 17 to 29 people in the most richest country in the world. So they were doing something good. Is it only numbers? No, the health indicators are very, very interesting. The life expectancy is about 73 years, and that's in 2010. The newborn birth with weight less than 2.5 is 9.2. That's comparable to everywhere on Earth even. The deliveries attended by trained personnel is 96%. Infant attended by trained personnel at birth is 96%. It's comparable to United States and probably a little better. That's a schematic to show you the mortality of children less than 5 years old. From 1970 to 2009, the mortality dropped about 600%. Same thing, infant mortality at birth. And again, it dropped tremendously. And probably the interesting number is this number, and that's probably the most commonly used indicator of the health. The health of health care in a country is the mortality of the mother at birth per 100,000 mother. It started about 500 in 1970. In 2009, it was 52. I can tell you my experience in here in Jersey City, where I practice, we have more than 150 in here in the United States. So they reached a level that is really admirable. This is the life expectancy, went up about 20 years from 1970 till now. Now what happened? What happened after the sanction? And that's again, all of those numbers are from the World Health Organization. Okay, now with what's happening now, we have about 20% of the hospitals are partially damaged. We have 37 disabled. We have reduced capability because lack of fuel, there is no electricity, and there is no way to repair those hospitals for now. There is an increased demand on the hospitals, obviously, because people are moved from one area to the other because of the conflict and what's happening. In Latakia, that's a city in northern Syria, there is a visit in the emergency department every 32 seconds. Some rooms are used as shelters, obviously, because of lack of houses now. The workforce, about 70% in major cities, for 70% of workers live in rural areas, like in New York and the around area. And the traveling is becoming really a problem because sanction does not allow you to get cars, and obviously there's no fuel, security, it's a problem. And most important, the snipers that our beloved rebels are doing, they sit on a roadway and they sniper 1 or 2 people, and then the road is blocked because everybody's going to be scared. So they're not reaching the hospitals, and people are traveling around. Physicians, plenty of them fled, but most importantly, even the people that did not flee, and this is an example in Aleppo, From 5,000 private physicians, only 36 are still practicing now. But like I said, more importantly than the leave-in is that the system is broken. Now the system of referral, that you saw your primary doctor, you want to be referred to a gynecologist, you want to see a cardiologist, you have a cancer, you want to continue treatment, all of that is broken and it's disrupted. And important stuff in here that the ambulances are damaged, and unfortunately they're not able to get the ambulances to be because of the sanction. The pharmaceutical issue is rather interesting. Prior to 2011, prior to March, prior to the sanction, the Syrian government managed to have 90% of the needed medication produced internally. They had plenty of them both as a bulk, and then they were able to make them in pills, and they were able to manage with that. And the medication were really reasonable in price. Everything was working wonderfully. Now, only 10% of those factories are available. What happened to them? Plenty of them were damaged, but more importantly, a big portion were stolen. They take the factory, all of it, to Turkey because the regime is bad. Can you imagine that because of a regime, you need to take a factory of medication from one country to the other?
They bombed the factory like
They bombed factories
a
too.
week ago, like the rebels bombed the whole pharmaceutical factory, just like Noida.
Right. That's happened a lot. But by the end, we have a critical shortage of all medication, including painkillers, antibiotic, diabetic medications. How am I doing with time? All right, that's only a few minutes. Another very interesting picture is the sanitation. And again, that's probably a medal on their chest, that they were able to manage initially to get 75 gallon per person per day of clean water. And that's not available in the United States. Definitely not available in more than 70% of the countries in the world. But with this critical stuff now they drop to 25 gallon. Now, when they drop to 25 gallon, you're not able to collect garbage. And the toilets in those, collective accommodation, what happens is when people are, kicked out of their homes, the government will have some collective, accommodation area like in arenas or in dorms for universities and stuff. But now you have a lot more people than the capacity planned for. And now you have more than 50 to 70 people for one toilet. So if they're not able to reach the toilet and there is no clean water and the garbage is not collected, you're going to expect what we're going to see. That's the garbage that you can see now. You have in Syria registered 430 diabetic. Out of that is 40,000 in children. They're not able to get insulin. The problem is that even when they get the insulin, they're not able to keep it refrigerated to reach the children. The refrigerator, you're not allowed to send them refrigerator, you're not able to send them money because of the sanction. In Raqqa, which was a big hospital that the World Health Organization is talking about, they were a center for cancer and for hemodialysis, but they were overwhelmed because all the hospitals next to them closed and people moved to them. So in the day that in a center in the United States you get for every bed about 6 or 7 hemodialysis patients, and there they have about 40 for every bed. So they started stretching them more, and obviously this is critical. And obviously I cannot say, okay, this is $40,000, I'm going to send you a machine. There is a sanction, you're not supposed to send them machines. And by the end, there is an early warning system for disease outbreak in Syria. In 2013, that's the first week of June, you have a watery diarrhea that was 240. In the third week of the same month, in 2 weeks, they reported 600. There is a 172% increase of diarrhea only in 2 weeks. The same period of time, hepatitis A, was reported 48 and 153. It's about 200%. So this is the start, and that's in June of 2013. So now you know that there is a real issue, there is a real problem by numbers, and that's World Health Organization. Leishmania is a parasite that the vector to take it from one place to the other is called the sand bug. And it was endemic in an area in Syria. They had all the control on it, and they can inject the medication in the sewer and everything would be fine. Now because every place, people went every other place, now it's spreading all over. They don't have the usual protection that they have, those insecticide-treated nets, bed nets, that they put on people so those parasites don't move to another person. Now it's spreading all over, and it's reaching even the countries nearby. Measles, it's an interesting problem. The vaccination prior to 2010 was about 95%, 2010, 2011. Now again, no refrigeration, no what they call a cold chain of command for the vaccination. It's not available anymore. So it's only 45% vaccinated now. And now in 2010, 2011, no reported cases. Now we have 139. 77% of those reported were not vaccinated. I'm going to stop in here, and probably by the end, if you guys have any questions. Did I extend the time?
I think you so much addressed the question, what is at stake?
Right.
What is at stake for the people of Syria? And what's at stake right here with infant mortality in Jersey City 3 times as high as what it had been in Syria? Those are really shameful figures for right here. We're in a country where 1/4 of the population there's not potable water for, in the richest country in the world. I know in Jersey City,
because we live.
regularly they tell you, there's regular days and they tell you boil your water. Isn't that an outrage in itself? But this is the cost of war. Our next speaker is Joyce Chediac, a Lebanese American. She's a contributor to Workers' World newspaper and Global Research. She's the author of Gaza, Symbol of Resistance. Copies are available at the table in the back. And the U.S.-NATO war in the war on Syria. She's written on the Middle East issues for 40 years, has helped to organize here at home to get the U.S. out of the Middle East, and really, having known Joyce for many, many years, she's both such an effective organizer and explainer. Joyce Chediac.
Sorry for the maze. Okay. Thank you.
Well, that was very moving, and thank you very much for the hard facts.
Thank you.
Because the U.S. is financing this war to save the people of Syria, and the people of Syria are the first and most extreme casualties of it. And I think that your presentation really brought that home. This is not a civil war. It's certainly not a revolutionary struggle. It's a counter-revolution. The fighters are proxies and foot soldiers for world imperialism and for Israel. And for those in the U.S. who are against Assad, particularly now, you need to look at either side and see who you are lined up with. On one side, you'll see the Pentagon. On the other side, Israel. And behind you are the original colonial oppressors in the Middle East. The goal is the dismemberment of Syria and destruction of its territorial integrity and its culture and economy, and to destroy the anti-imperialist alliance that Syria has with Iran and with Hezbollah, in order to maintain independence and to pick them off one by one. U.S. and its NATO allies and regional clients are using the Arab Spring, truly a mass and inspirational outpouring, but without a unified leadership, as a cover for a sea change in the Middle East, to destroy any states with independence, and recarve the area for their own purposes. To redraw the map of the Middle East as it did in the secret Sykes-Picot Treaty during World War I, to have more direct access to the natural resources of the Middle East and give nothing to the people. Already in a weakened Iraq, instead of even going to their puppet Iraqi government for oil, they're going directly to Kurdistan because they can get a better deal directly from Kurdistan than from their own government. So that's what they want to do. There's no functioning government in Libya, but the oil keeps getting pumped out. And they want to do the same thing in Syria. Destroy it as a state. That's my view. Who is Bashar Assad? Are the legitimate grievances against him? I think there's much confusion in the U.S. movement here. Certainly he's not a revolutionary. But one thing he has done, he's kept Syria together, and his family have kept Syria together. This is not a Sunni versus Shia area of the world. It's a mosaic. There are about 20 different religious, ethnic, and cultural groups in Syria. And there's a whole network of ways that the wheels are greased socially and culturally. Maybe not perfectly, but there's a lot of pride in this in the Levant area. Now, the fighting is seeking to destroy all that. People are being killed by identity and religion. The suspicion is being created, and there are population shifts due to it. Assad has protected the Palestinians. The Palestinians in the camp of Syria are treated the best in any of the frontline states. He has allowed the more radical Palestinian groups and Hamas to have headquarters in Damascus. He stands up against Syria, against Israel, and there's still a state of war with Israel, and Syria demands the return of the Golan Heights. But there are legitimate grievances against Assad. There's repression, and there have been, in any country where one family has ruled for 40 years, there's going to be legitimate grievances. But the main thing is that in 2005, Syria went along with the IMF and World Bank neoliberal policies and sold off a lot of the state-run enterprises. Cronies of Assad, the Assad family, grew rich, and others did. Many were Sunni. And tens of thousands were laid off. There was even though conditions remained very good, there was a breaking of the social contract, and a lot of the opposition to Assad was based on that. But that's not why the imperialists dislike him. They like him for that, because he followed their instructions. He eroded his base, and they went right in. That's what happened. There's two sides on this. Now, who's the opposition? The opposition, the leadership has always been from the outside, calling the shots have been people long allied with the West. It's been repeatedly said in the press that they're hopelessly divided, fighting among themselves for booty. For instance, in December 2011, Burhan Balioun, a leader of the Syrian National Council at the time, told the Wall Street Journal that he would open up Syria to the West, end Syria's strategic relations with Iran and with the Lebanese and Palestinian resistance, and really Syria with the Gulf regimes, those bastions of democracy. The head of the Syrian National Coalition right now, the opposition to Assad, is an American, Ghassan Hito. Not even a Syrian, he's an American. The opposition has no political program, no real goals. They rely on the Takfiri groups, al-Nusra and Syria, who are the most effective fighting force. Takfiri, these are unpredictable, way fringe religious groups that come out of the despair of the area, and they're financed by the U.S. Many started in Iraq under the U.S. occupation. They did not exist there under Saddam Hussein. According to Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, these are Sunni groups that accuse other groups of apostasy, which to them is punishable by death. In Iraq, he said they have killed Shias and Sunnis, blown up mosques and churches, killed tribal elders, killed people lining up to vote, which is considered apostasy, between 4,000 and 5,000 suicide bombers on a religious basis. They exist in Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Somalia, and now Syria. They also kill Sunnis who don't agree with them. This is not a Shia versus Sunni thing. Another name for them would be death squads. So how did they get in Syria? In 2005, the U.S. withdrew its ambassador, but Syrians put in these economic neoliberal policies. So the ambassador came back in 2011. They sent John Ford. Now, John Ford studied under Negroponte in Iraq, the ambassador. People remember Negroponte from the 80s? He set up the death squads in El Salvador. Well, many feel that he is responsible for the beginning of these Takfiri groups in Iraq. And John Ford was his acolyte. 2 months after Ford came into office in Syria, the fighting started. He's no longer ambassador there, but he continues to direct the U.S. aspect of that campaign from Washington. He made a secret visit to Syria last month as part of that effort. So the U.S. has it both ways. They say they hate Assad and they hate al-Nusra, but they're pushing al-Nusra. They're behind al-Nusra. They've resurrected groups like this. They use racism and anti-Islam bigotry as their weapon. The imperialists then try to lump all religious forces in the Middle East together. But the truth is that they hate it when anti-imperialists fight in the name of religion, like the Iranian Revolution, like Hezbollah in Lebanon. But they work very hard to foment and finance oppressed peoples and workers fighting each other in the name of religion. And the imperialists try to make this happen as much as they can. And because then they can say it's entirely something else over here and they can fool us. We must not be fooled by this, nor by the racist war against Islam, a religion of the oppressed, being waged by the U.S. government right here at home as well as abroad. Now, the real reason I think that the U.S. is upping the ante, that it's giving small arms web, that's talking about no-fly zone, is that it's really lost on the ground. The major battles in the border areas with Lebanon have been pretty decisive. The fighting continues, but the so-called rebels have all but lost. So the U.S. is now the media says it's because of Hezbollah. Well, Hezbollah has maybe 1,000, maybe 2,000 fighters. It's a small group in a small country. But this could not have happened without support from the Assad government among the Syrian people. According to information collected by NATO and published May 31st by Middle East Newsline, which is a subscription newsline which specializes in military-related developments in the Middle East, 70% of Syrians support the Assad regime, another 20% were neutral, and the remaining 10% expressed support for the rebels. This was a compilation by NATO of data from humanitarian workers in and around Syria, Western humanitarian workers in and around Syria. Quote, "The Sunnis have no love for Assad, but the great majority of the community is withdrawing from the revolt. What is left is the foreign forces who are sponsored by Qatar and Saudi Arabia. They are seen by the Sunnis as far worse than Assad. Syrian Sunnis are likely disgusted by the behavior of the foreign extremists, which include a laundry list of war crimes, ethnic cleansing, as well as the terrorist bombing of a Sunni mosque that killed the top Sunni cleric in Syria." And there's a list of other examples. We don't see this poll in the Western press or any other ones like it. So the U.S. escalation is really going against the will of the Syrian people at this point. Also, a poll by Pew Research Center said that 65% of the population here opposes U.S. assistance or intervention of any kind in Syria. So the U.S. government is going against the will of the people here in these escalation moves. Says it's bringing democracy, but it doesn't respect the will of the people here or in Syria. So what's the problem? My view is that the problem is capitalism. The problem is a system which is so enamored with profits above people, above the environment, that the capitalists will sell their own mother for a profit. They are so short-sighted in their push for profits that they'll sell you the rope to hang them with if they can get enough money for it. It's a sick system. It's a system that produces great amount of goods, but when they can't sell them as a profit, they refuse to give them away, and people are left without jobs, and they're hungry, and they have no homes. And in order to continue making profits, they have wars, and they destroy the means of production so they can rebuild them and make profits. And that's what imperialism is. And that war drive is built into the system, and it cannot be reformed, and it must be destroyed. The demonization of Assad, of Islam, the view that there are no good guys in this situation, leads to indifference. Yet every imperialist victory hurts us here. It only emboldens the capitalists because it's two faces of the same system. The increase in technology has led to the ability to wage many imperialist wars at the same time. That was not true in the Vietnam era. So there's Afghanistan, there's Iraq, there's Syria, and now there's threats to Venezuela, and there's threats to Ecuador as well. We need to up the ante of the political consciousness in the anti-war movement to meet this situation. We need an anti-war movement that is thoroughly anti-imperialist and identifies it as the main enemy of humanity and defends unconditionally all the peoples and governments that it attacks.
Thank you, Joyce Chediac. I'd like to also thank several members of the media, people's media really, who are here today, and to say that tonight's meeting will be, and the links for it will be posted out very widely, along with the information from Dr. Moussa and the material of tonight's forum, because we really see this as an educational resource for the movement as a whole. Our next speaker is Bill Dores, who, an activist for 45 years, was among the first non-Arab activists for Palestine in the U.S. And Bill was in Palestine with Joyce during the first Intifada, where they were detained and they left to avoid arrest by Israeli occupation forces. In 2009, Bill helped to organize the Viva Palestina U.S. aid convoy to break the blockade of Gaza with British MP George Galloway. He's a member of the International Action Center since its founding. He's an active member of Al-Auda, New York, the Palestine Right to Return Coalition, and in 2008 was elected the vice chair for external affairs of the International League of People's Struggles. He's also a lifelong union member and labor activist. Bill Dores.
Good evening. It's been a great week for democracy in the USA, the land of mass incarceration. the Supreme Court struck down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act that so many black people and their allies fought and died for. The Federal Bureau of Prisons has denied compassionate release to our hero Lynn Stewart, the people's lawyer who's been imprisoned for doing her job and defending her clients. And Edward Snowden, another hero, is on the run for telling the people of this country that the United States government, the National Security Agency, the most expensive U.S. government agency, is spying on pretty much everybody in the world. Meanwhile, John Boots on the Ground Kerry, the 2004 so-called anti-war candidate who complained Bush hadn't sent enough troops to Iraq, has virtually taken up residence in the Arab world, working hands-on with the royal families, the royal tyrants of Saudi Arabia and Jordan and the Gulf, the Arabian Gulf, to bring Washington's version of democracy to Syria. Yesterday he was in Qatar, where the Saudi Arabia just engineered a coup, forcing the emir to resign in favor of his even worse son, which the Syrian National Council called a pioneering event. The Syrian National Council is the U.S.-supported opposition leaders. The king giving the power to his prince is a pioneering blow for democracy. Before that, he was in Egypt, where President Morsi had actually taken a less belligerent position on Syria, and Kerry showed up, and now, right after that, Morsi broke relations with Syria, which he hasn't done with Israel. We can see Kerry's version of freedom in not only in the reign of terror going on in the so-called liberated areas of Syria, the beheadings and floggings and amputations, but also in the lynchings of Shiites in Egypt a couple of days ago, and in the murder of Lebanese soldiers by Takfiri cleric Sheikh Amir, who is now on the run in the port of Saida. Sheikh Asir, sorry. We can see it in the rain of tear gas and rubber bullets unleashed by Turkey's NATO regime on peaceful protesters, and in the daily terror by Israeli soldiers and U.S.-born settlers on the West Bank, and in the continued bombing of Gaza and blockade of Gaza imposed by U.S.-made weapons in the hands of the Israeli state. The prime agents in this democratic crusade are some of the very forces the U.S. government has used to justify the police state they're trying to impose here. The same forces who ripped apart the resistance movement in Iraq by turning it into a sectarian conflict. I'm referring to the Saudi-paid and funded so-called jihadists. Sectarian war across the region is what Washington wants. It is what Israel wants. It's what the Pentagon wants. They want not only the Syrian soldiers and Syrian nationalists to die, they want the young people who were sucked into this so-called jihad to die. Meanwhile, Guantanamo remains open. Mass racial profiling and surveillance and entrapment of Muslims in the United States continues. And there are now U.S. boots on the ground in Jordan, over 1,000 troops, with more coming, and 400 U.S. soldiers are on the way to Egypt. The bankers, the Wall Street, the 1% are champing at the bit for a larger war. The Economist, this week, I wish I brought it, it's the mouthpiece of the City of London. The Wall Street of London has, "Can Iran be stopped?" is the front page, is the cover, and its answer is yes, by invading Syria. The Wall Street Journal has the same line, and so does the Washington Post, the Pentagon's house organ. There, the brother in the back has a copy. So the question is, can Iran be stopped from doing what? I'll get back to that. I was in South Lebanon and in Beirut in 2006, right after the Israeli invasion. Right after, the Lebanese People's Resistance, led by Hezbollah, a Shiite-based party, inflicted the first major military defeat on Israel's racist, U.S.-armed, murderous war machine. I saw the terrible destruction inflicted by U.S.-made weapons on Ben Shabail and the many towns in South Lebanon. And I also saw that the resistance could not have won, in the real world could not have won, without the assistance of Syria and Iran. And in fact, Gaza could not have held out without the assistance of Syria and Iran. And in fact, Syria played a key role in helping the first Intifada in Palestine. while we were there, we were heading back to Beirut from South Lebanon. There was the assassination of the Pierre Gemayel, the leader of the Lebanese fascist party, the Phalange. It was a factional fight between him and the Lebanese forces, two right-wing Christian organizations, Christian-based organizations, so-called Christian organizations. And for 3 days, sectarian mobs waving French flags were attacking Syrian workers in Beirut, in central Beirut. And myself and my friends I was there with were about to leave, and I was in a cafe when the TV, Saeed Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, came on the television and said, "I want everybody in Beirut tomorrow morning." And the next morning, from the north, from the east, not from the west, as the sea, from the south, Shiites, Christians, Sunnis, Kurds, Armenians streamed into Beirut to show support for the resistance and to demand an end some political reform in Lebanon. And it was just then, at that very moment, when the potential for popular unity on when a Shiite-led militia had the admiration of the entire Arab and Islamic world, when there was a potential for popular unity on a basis, at a rare moment that it was very hard to find, then the princes of the Hashemite royal family in Jordan and the Saudi family in Arabia and of the Gulf, and the characters like John Negroponte and Robert Abrams from the State Department began talking about the danger, how the Middle East was about to be ripped apart by a sectarian war, and the danger of the Shiite crescent, and it had to be stopped. And right away they began working to implement this sectarian policy, to make this a reality, this grim prediction a reality. It began with Saudi money flowing to Takfiri groups in Lebanon, like the Sheikh Asrs and Saida. Meanwhile, U.S. weapons began flowing to the internal security forces in Lebanon to build it up as a counterweight to the army. This is controlled by the right-wing U.S.-backed March 14th movement. And as we know from the French foreign minister, or former French foreign minister Dumas, the British began training commandos to fight against the Syrian government several years ago. And I was back in Lebanon in January 2009 as U.S.-made bombs and missiles were raining down on Gaza. And I was attending a conference representing the IAC at a conference along with Sara, at a conference hosted by the Lebanese resistance. And a major theme of that conference was South-South unity. There were huge delegations there from Venezuela and from Iran, building an economic network around the world that was independent of the United States. But meanwhile, on the other side, in the March 14th controlled neighborhoods of Beirut, the Saudi flag was flying everywhere. The U.S.-Saudi-Qatari alliance, the same alliance that enticed Iraq to attack Iran in a bloody fratricidal war in which 1 million died, and then they turned on Iraq when the war was over to destroy it. The same alliance that financed this very similar operation, the biggest CIA covert operation to date in Afghanistan in the 80s. These are the forces behind the war in Syria. The division in the Arab the division in the Arab world goes back. Really, a division goes back to 1952, the Egyptian Revolution, the Iraqi Revolution, 1956, the Algerian War for Independence, when two blocks came into existence: a nationalist bloc that basically wanted to use its resources to develop the country in the way that Dr. Moussa described in Syria, and those royal families who were willing to turn their countries and all their oil resources into cash cows for Wall Street banks, for the arms contractors, and for the oil companies. That war was fought out in a bloody proxy war in Yemen in the early 60s, and it was the Israeli attack on Syria and Egypt in 1967 that tilted the balance in favor of the royal families by devastating the Egyptian and Syrian economies. So the Saudi monarchs really owe their thrones and their heads to Israel, but they've repaid that many times over because there's plenty of Saudi money going into Israel via Wall Street. There are those on the left who say that the Syrian government is not genuinely anti-imperialist, but I think these folks don't know what anti-imperialism means or what imperialism means. They say it's just acting out of its material interest. Duh. Yeah. people, states, and classes do act out of their own material interests. But there is a real conflict of material interest between those who would want to develop their own country, develop like the Syrian government, which wants to develop the means of production, the productive forces in Syria, and imperialism, which wants to destroy them. Because imperialism, it's not an abstract word, it's not about hegemony and domination. Imperialism is the rule of monopoly capitalism, monopoly capital, and it's the banks, and it's about destruction. It's about destroying any means of production, any resources, productive forces that they don't own or control. They're not afraid of Iranian nuclear bombs. They're afraid of Iranian oil and gas. They're afraid of a pipeline maybe running through from Iran, through Syria, through Iraq, to Lebanon, so that oil that the U.S., that ExxonMobil doesn't own can come on the world market. And maybe the revenues from that will be reinvested in the region. They're afraid of an Alba-like formation coming into being in the Arab world and the Islamic world like it does in Latin America. And it's exactly to prevent the emergence of such an economic zone. They're afraid of a Middle East where they are no longer a player, where they don't matter anymore, their dollars and their guns. That's why they maintain Israel at the crossroads of Asia and Africa, and of Asia and Africa is basically a giant U.S. military base. But there's something even bigger at stake, because for most of us, because this war drive is they're not only threatening war with Iran or in war in Syria, which people may think they can do on the cheap, by mercenaries or whatever, and airplanes and no troops on the ground. They're threatening. Their greed is so great, their drive to destroy is so great. They're risking war with Russia over this. And in fact, this is if you look at what's happening in Syria today, in the Middle East today, I can't help but thinking of the maneuvers before World War II in Europe. Because the same economic forces, the different as the government is, the same economic forces that drove Germany, Nazi Germany, into war are pressing on the United States. The need to expand, and this is the Cold War didn't end when the Soviet Union collapsed, because the United States doesn't want any industrial rivals, capitalist or socialist, in the world. That's the drive of Wall Street, and but there is a force greater than the Pentagon and greater than their hoarded gold, and that's the might of the people. That's the might of the people, which we can see in action not only in the heroic fighters of the Syrian army from all religions, who were standing up to this, who were been fighting under incredible hard conditions, and not only in the fighters of Hezbollah who have sacrificed so much. We see it in the people of Turkey, who have shut down the northern front that the U.S., the Pentagon, wanted to use to arm the so-called rebels, the Contras. By the way, Saudi Arabia funded the Nicaraguan Contras in the 70s and 80s at Ronald Reagan's request. In the 1930s, when war was on the horizon in Europe, the people of the world, anyone who stood for justice or freedom, knew they had to stand with the Republic of Spain against fascism, against imperialism. And Syria is the Spain of today in the Middle East. Only this time, so much is at stake, we have to ensure that they shall not pass.
Thank you, Bill. Our next speaker, Dr. Barbara Nimri Aziz, is a veteran anthropologist. She turned to journalism in 1989 with her first assignment in Syria. And since then, she's visited Syria 12 to 15 times. Most recently, she spent 2 years teaching communications in Syria between 2009 and 2012, during which she witnessed the nascent civil protests, then the uprising, and the opening military conflict. Barbara is the author of 5 books, most recently a handbook for radio journalists published in 2012 in Arabic. This is right here. And she is also the author of Swimming Up the Tigris, Real-Life Encounters in Iraq, a testimony of the embargo against Iraq from 1990 to 2003. You can hear her reports on Syria between 2009 to 2011 by her podcast, radiotahrir.org. And she's also the founder and host for 24 years of Radio Tahrir on WBAI Radio 99.5. Barbara Aziz.
Thank you, Sara, and thank you all for coming tonight. I see a lot of familiar faces. And on the one hand, you know, it's wonderful to see people continuing the struggle and that we're still here somehow. On the other, it's like I've had this nightmare before. We were together for 15 odd years, 13 years, working in Iraq. I went with IAC delegations on several occasions to try to inform Americans about the realities of the culture and the history, but also of what sanctions can do. And as Kathy Kelly said, sanctions are a form of, they're a weapon of mass destruction. I'm going to speak about sanctions now, particularly one institution and how the sanctions have affected it. You know, it's a pity that it's only when we have bombs and bloody body parts and missiles and rifles and masked gunmen and snipers that we get to know a country. And even then, we don't know it. We see really the superficial. Yes, there's blood. Yes, it's ugly. Yes, there's death. Yes, houses collapse and people flee. But underneath that, there is a more serious, I believe, devastation going on, which I believe our American government is quite efficient at implementing, and I want to talk about that. As you know, I'm an anthropologist. I'm not a political analyst or a political scientist. I'm an anthropologist, and as in my radio work and my writing, I look at economic, social, cultural institutions. Now, an audience like you, I know you're very sophisticated. I'm not trying to flatter you, but you know that everything is political. So it's not just about parties and leadership, it's about the basic infrastructure of a society. Poison gas, foreign fighters, sectarian massacres, 90,000 dead, no-fly zones, these frightening, unhelpful, and wearying words define Syria today. So let's take time for another drama. Syrian TV serials. Now don't laugh, please. Yes, the topic may seem inconsequential and out of place in a nation engulfed in violent conflict, but the subject is not too trivial for US-designed sanctions against its latest Arab enemy. Since 2012, Syrian TV has been dumped off the satellite Hotbird and US allies in the Gulf states who co-sponsored, transmitted, and once celebrated, enjoyed Syrian TV dramas, already withdrew their support and infrastructure for international distribution of Syrian TV programs. Now, why would they do that? The wider public, people who really know little about Syria except for conflict-related news during these 2 years are told that Syrian opinion is controlled by state media and free speech is prohibited there. It is difficult to talk freely in the country on a range of subjects, but much and most of what people are concerned with can be discussed and can be created through art and literature. So what could emanate, given that we are told that there is such severe censorship, what could emanate from that so-called brutal dictatorship that could be of any value to cause TV dramas to be embargoed and a valued industry crushed? Anyone familiar with the high quality and public issues Syrian television producers address will understand. In the last 12 or 15 years, Syria rose to become a major quality and influential source of original TV drama. Their productions captivated the entire Arab-speaking world, even eclipsing Egypt, whose highly popular dramas had hitherto prevailed. What Syrian dramas, most of which were produced privately within the country, offered is best illustrated by two recent productions, and you can Google these. It's very easy to Google them in English. One, Bab al-Hara, produced in 2006, and the other, Malakat Aymanakum, produced in 2010. The first is a colonial period drama typical of the fine historical productions Syria excelled in. Some, like Bab al-Hara, are 20th century. Others are set in much earlier periods of Arab history. And I believe, in general, Syria had remained the main source for historical Arabic productions, akin to what you might find from Britain. You know that in the English language, Britain excels in its 17th, 18th, 19th century dramas. Syria has that place in the Arab world and in Arab history or culture. People hold a deep significance across the Arab world. These dramas hold a deep significance across the Arab world through their portrayals and their reflections of cultural values and historical events. Mamalakat, by contrast to Bab al-Hara, explores contemporary social concerns. And I think this one you may relate to very well if you have a chance to view it, although I think it's not yet translated into any language other than, it's not translated to a foreign language. Those issues are religious fanaticism, homosexuality, and the abuse of women. Written by a Syrian woman, the author and presenter Hala Diab, D-I-Y-A-B. You can again find out about her easily. It was produced by her compatriot, the highly regarded director Najdat Mansour, and again you can find out about him through Wikipedia. The work of these brilliant Syrian artists is known across the Arab world. The Arab public also recognizes that few can match Syrian productions in their historical accuracy, their readiness to address the subjects noted, as well as Palestinian aspirations and rights. Now, one thing I just want to mention, I viewed only one Syrian production focusing on the Palestinian struggle where, believe it or not, the Israelis are the bad guys. I mean, you would never see this anywhere in Europe or certainly not in America. And the focus of the film I watched was the Israeli military, actually. They're gruff, they're corrupt, they're crude, they're masochistic, they're really disagreeable people. And those are played, by the way, by Syrians who have learned Hebrew in Syria to take up those positions, in the films. Then there is the issue, in terms of TV dramas from Syria, of authenticity. Syria is known to have the highest standards in the region in historical research applied to the arts and in Arabic language. And until this war began, Syria, you may know, was the primary country that people from all the world traveled to study Arabic. And they had developed their Arabic language institutions to an extent where they were doing very, very well in terms of their methodologies, and they were attracting, and therefore it was like another part of the economy that was being stimulated by the arrival of 2,000 or 3,000 that I knew of when I was there, mainly young people studying Arabic. Besides the technical, literary, and entertainment value of the stories of these dramas, Syria's TV dramas represented a fading political consciousness, that is, Arab nationalistic ideals. Many productions invoked a regional pride hard to find elsewhere. This was not unplanned. This was part of the government strategy and the government ideology, the sense of pride in culture which Syria, especially after the demise of Iraq as a center of cultural, linguistic, historical research, Syria maintained. And this, I believe, is one of the aims also of the American desire to destroy Syria. This is the last Arab state that is really so committed to Arab values and history and the language. Despite its low-quality news coverage and the stifling of political dissent and dialogue in Syria, through TV dramas, the country helped celebrate and sustain Arab national sentiment and secular values. You can see this for yourself on YouTube. You can just Google Syria TV dramas, or those two sources I gave, or the authors I mentioned. Meanwhile, by means of censorship by the West and its Gulf allies, the embargo against Syria has all but destroyed this institution, an institution loved and needed by Arab-speaking people worldwide. Whereas Syria produced 25 series for distribution internationally in 2011, producers were able to sell only one outside the country the following year, within months of US and European and Arab embargo. The industry essentially collapsed due to outside design. Now, as Dr. Ghias told you, the health system is, or the people are leaving because of the war and because of the difficulty of life, in this case, health professionals. But, as he said, the system is broken. So the conflict in Syria itself poses new obstacles to production of regular programming in the country. Thousands of Syria's most talented people and liberal thinking ones, from actors to musicians, writers, are out of work. Many have fled in search of employment in the Gulf states, while others have joined the opposition or are just sitting jobless. This is one of the many industries shattered by conflict, but the US and its friends had a special reason to attack something as apparently benign as Syrian TV dramas. Investment in production, in part from the Gulf states, was stopped. More important, networks in Saudi Arabia and Dubai, the major distributors, ceased carrying Syrian productions. And finally, area satellite carriers. The Arab League ordered Hotbird, Nilesat, and Arabsat to stop carrying Syrian media, including Syrian TV and Syrian drama TV. Of course, this has significant economic effects on Syria, but to me, as I've noted, the real aim is the cultural and ideological role of Syria in the region. One of the last remaining centers of Arab culture, with a government committed to promoting Arab nationalist pride, must be destroyed, according to US designs. It is undertaken willfully and strategically by the US and its allies in their aim to destroy Arab nationalist values and the place of Syria in this. Syrian dramas, I note, have been replaced now by an alternative in the media industry, Turkish TV dramas, translated into Arabic, among other languages. And with that, you have different themes. You do not have those historical themes. You do not have the addressing religious fanaticism or extremism, as the Syrians did. Now you have romances and family conflict. It helps the Turkish economy and keeps the public distracted or in a stupor, while the war keeps their private lives in turmoil. And just in finishing, I want to urge you to, I'm glad Dr. Moussa talked about the institutions, the health institutions that were available in the country. This, I'm sure he'll agree, will apply to education across the board, to research, to the development of dictionaries, to almost any institution you can think of. And the development of food, the distribution of food, the testing, etc., water, purification, all of this, I think we need to know how Syria developed in the last 20 years in particular, and what an extraordinary achievement it was, given that there were already sanctions against it, and given with those sanctions that the IMF and the World Bank would not offer Syria any loans at all. They got investments from elsewhere, but it was through their own energy and initiative and through Syrians returning from other parts of the world and investing in the country that it reached the economic level it had. And in the 22 years that I was visiting Syria, sometimes every 3 years or so, it's quite extraordinary. And I hope in future gatherings that you'll try to bring people or bring information about the Syrian economy and what they managed to achieve. Part of it, I have to admit, in a crowd, this group, part of it through capitalization. Syria has become much more privatized during the last 12 years. Thanks very much. And now I have pleasure in introducing my sister, Sara Flounders. She's co-director of the International Action Center, founded 21 years ago by Ramsey Clark to oppose U.S. militarism, racism, and war. Flounders is the editor and co-author of 10 books published by the IAC, and also the author of War Without Victory, the Pentagon's Achilles Heel, published this year. She coordinates the StopWarOnIran.org campaign, and she's an organizer with the United National Anti-War Coalition, UNAC. She has organized fact-finding delegations to countries and struggles targeted by the U.S. government, including Palestine, Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, Sudan, Cuba, Colombia, to build solidarity and challenge the corporate media propaganda and racist demonization that is used to justify U.S. wars. She has traveled to Syria twice to participate in Palestine solidarity conferences. She has helped build support during the trials and ongoing appeals of many U.S. political prisoners, including Afia Siddiqui and our human rights attorney, Lynn Stewart. Sarah.
Well, thank you to this excellent panel. I want to take us back 100 years ago, the end of World War I. It was the British and French Empire, the British and French imperialists, who really divided the Arab world, the entire Middle East. A secret treaty at the time, revealed before the days of WikiLeaks, actually a treaty revealed by the Russian Revolution. It was called the Sykes-Picot Treaty. And what's happening today, you could say at a later time, just before the end of World War II, the dividing of Syria. So it's always happened by outside big powers coming into the region to carve it up in their own interests, not in the interests of the people. And it's a ruthless process. And part of what is going on today is really, again, a redivide of the region, an attempt to do so on a brutal sectarian ground, and on the basis of trying to destroy any of the governments that had an independent policy that had benefited the people. The war today in Syria is extremely dangerous and could become much more so. Could become more dangerous because U.S. policy has suffered an enormous setback. I mean, really, in every way, they're losing. The very force they have created has been unable to have even a paper unity, unable to even be in the same room together or reach any kind of agreement, unable to have a unified military command, and unable to stand up to a very well-organized Syrian resistance. And they're collapsing on every side. But the threat of a no-fly zone, the threat of deeper U.S. intervention is very real. And it really is an acid test for this movement in this country right now. Because in a war, everyone is forced to take sides. And that is what is at stake today. We can't forget what the U.S. did in Iraq. A quarter of the population ended up dead, disabled, or dislocated. That is a horrendous toll. And what it meant to the culture and the people of Iraq, what a crime against humanity on every level. When you see what was done to Libya, where really a no-fly zone meant massive bombardment and destruction of every city in Libya, and the U.S. simply taking hold of $100 billion of Libyan reserves that were to be the basis of a African currency, a currency for all of Africa. And immediately after the assassination of Gaddafi, there was the announcement of AFRICOM, U.S. troops in 35 countries in Africa. So there's a lot at stake. And of course, U.S. corporate power that benefits so fabulously from war and militarism, huge profits, super profits, they never fight in their own name or in their own stated interests. It's always an effort to mobilize a population here by completely demonizing a leader, someone whose name was totally unknown to the population here, can suddenly become a face of evil incarnate. Media is very powerful. And the corporate media really acts as an arm of corporate power and military power to make it palpable. They appeal to humanitarian sentiments and raw fear. It's ABC. This is something I think everyone here knows. But it's always good to step back and repeat it again on a new war, because somehow it gets forgotten in the barrage of propaganda. Now these wars are always through vague alliances that are referred, which take it off of the U.S. You know, it's NATO. That's simply U.S. military commanded alliance of the big imperial powers, those former colonial powers, or a UN flag, such as was used in Iraq, Libya, today still in Afghanistan, earlier in Korea, where there's still U.S. troops more than 60 years later. They use proxies, the very states created and held together by U.S. power, where there's a thin privileged layer whose wealth is totally dependent on U.S. weapons and used against their own people. And I want to talk a little bit about some of these proxies, because it's important You know, for 2 years now, the U.S. has claimed in all the media that they're not arming the Syrian opposition. They said $60 million in some night vision goggles. Is there anyone here that believes that? The arms just happen to be coming through Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Now, Qatar is completely a U.S. creation. 94% of the population aren't citizens. They have no rights whatsoever. That means to health care, to schools, to vote, to anything. They're immigrant workers. There's a military, a U.S. creation, armed and trained, of only 10,000. It's really a huge air force, and there's a big air base, which Qatar volunteered to pay for the U.S. air bases in Qatar. It's a command center for the entire region. Does anyone think that any of the population of Qatar volunteered for such a thing? And, of course, the arms flooding into Syria, paid by this tiny Qatar monarchy. The same thing in Saudi Arabia, a tiny, thin layer. The entire country named after the Saud royal family. No representation whatsoever. And as the speakers pointed out, the pipeline that Iran is building is very much a target of all this. How to break up any economic cooperation in the region is very much the purpose of these proxies flooding arms into Syria. Now, we could look at the role of Turkey, more than 60 years a member of NATO. There are 24 NATO bases in Turkey. That's not a small footprint. It's huge. And yet, it's important to recognize that it was millions of people in the streets in 2003 that forced the government to refuse to allow Turkish bases, NATO bases, to be used in Turkey in the invasion of Iraq. So sometimes the people can play a big role. We should keep that in mind today in these huge demonstrations taking place in Turkey. We should keep in mind the huge outpourings, millions in Turkey, against Israel at the time of the Mavi Marmara. In 2006 and in 2009, people played a big role. So all is not set, and we should always keep that in mind. A lot of this is meant to break up even the relations. Turkey had very favorable, very good economic, political, diplomatic relations with Syria, with Iran, with Lebanon, until the beginning of this war. And that's what also imperialism wants to break up. They want to break up any ability of the people of the region to trade and exchange with each other. All must go through Washington and Wall Street. That's the determination. We could look at the role of the sanctions, the embargo, which break up the economic relations in the entire region. And in this, what's called the Arab League, that's really, again, it's the monarchies, the Gulf states. Now, I'm glad one of the speakers referred to Ambassador Ford, U.S. Ambassador. His role, aid to Negroponte, his role in setting up the death squads, the U.S. role in El Salvador, in Iraq. Negroponte is truly a man with blood on his hands. When they say there can't be any diplomatic discussion with anyone with blood on their hands, well, we should ask them, who on earth is Ambassador Ford? Now, if the anti-war movement will be a serious force in the U.S. today, and it was a powerful force at the time of the U.S. war on Iraq, then it has to take sides. It has to take a firm stand against the war and against the efforts to use the worst forms of sectarian division. This is really armed and organized and orchestrated from Langley, Virginia, from the CIA. Overwhelmingly. It's not part of the culture in Syria. It was not part of the culture in Iraq. We look at the horrendous toll in Afghanistan. You would think things couldn't have gotten worse. But the U.S. occupation, invasion and occupation, there hasn't been a moment of peace or of development. All the plans that there would be a new Marshall Plan, did any of that happen? So I hope tonight we have a lot of time for discussion. There's some people here who have a great deal of information and of knowledge. I do very much want to, though, end my remarks by talking about that weapons alone don't decide history. Today, there are more weapons held by the U.S. The military budget is larger than the whole rest of the world put together. But this government is an empire in serious decline and decay. And they learned the hard way in Vietnam, in Iraq, and now in Afghanistan. They're handing Bagram Air Base back to Afghanistan. Why is that? It's no longer secure. There's not one part of it, including the prison at Bagram, that is safe area. Every day there's a new attack. This is something that Israel, with all of its weapons, seen just a generation ago as the force that allowed the U.S. not to be in the region. The Israelis did it for them, made war on the entire region. And yet they couldn't hold 10 feet of Lebanese territory in 2006. That's a fact. Nor have they been able to defeat tiny, encircled Gaza. That's incredible. The people of Gaza built 1,000 tunnels to bring in food and supplies. So there is an enormous capacity of people to resist. And this is what we need to see and be aware of today. That U.S. wars are terrible. They take a terrible toll here and especially on the countries that are targeted. But they have been resisted. We need to even look at what's happening in Guantanamo. More than 100 prisoners who there was no evidence on. By the U.S. own estimates, 92% of all the prisoners at Guantanamo were simply cases of mistaken identity. And yet they were tortured, held more than 12 years, and now are being tortured every day with tubes. It's an important day for us to recognize the ruling that just came down against Lynn Stewart. And Ralph Pointer, who's here tonight, I hope he'll, before we end this meeting, give us an update on Lynn. But yesterday she was denied compassionate release, even though she has 4th stage cancer. But asking compassion from this government is quite a challenge. Nevertheless, we stand with Lynn and her resistance. So let's turn the discussion over to the audience. I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank so much of the People's Media who's here today also. I think that's very important. And let's remain both confident and determined, not be embarrassed or afraid to take sides in a war where there is no basis for this war. When we say hands off Syria, let the Syrian people decide, that has to become the basis of everything we do and be understood by by people right here in the U.S. When we say we need jobs and health care, not another war, that needs to resonate. Thank you. Next we have Kazem Azin from C Solidarity with Iran.
Thank you so much for excellent presentation by all the speakers, especially Dr. and Barbara Nimri Aziz from a completely different point of view, explaining what the government of Syria did for the people. And I wanted just to tell you that as a major reason. This is the major reason that the United States attacks these states, because they want a completely capitalist state. They don't even want you to retreat to neoliberalism, as Libya did sometimes and Bashar Assad did sometimes. They made a mistake. They opened the door. They opened the door and they made a mistake. Now they want the whole thing. They don't want education for the people of Syria. They don't want health. They don't want the public to be wealthy. They want a bunch of capitalists to steal the country and control it. It's the Arab nation especially is one of the most oppressed nation in the world. I know the black nation, Africa, is extremely oppressed, but the Arab nation is extremely oppressed because of the oil. Because of the oil, no country was divided, no nation was divided to the small pieces like Arab nation. They created Shah to oppose the Arab nation. They created Israel in order to oppose the Arab nation. Because without these two, the Arab nation would be united, so they try to divide as much as they can. So we should go oppose this. They helped a lot to make Iraqi hate Iranian people and Iranian hate the Iraqi people. And our leader made major mistake, including Saddam Hussein and others. We should never lose our understanding the major enemy is imperialism. They want us. They want to divide Sunni and Shia. Otherwise, the Iran revolution pick up the slogan for this, defending Palestinian people. Palestinian people are Sunnis. And we're going to stand by them forever. We don't let the Israel and American destroy the Palestinian people. We never let that happen. And we're going to be side by side with the Syrian people. And I hope the Iraqi nation understand we are brothers and sisters against the imperialism, Zionism, and the war. We should unite. We should not let them divide us and rule us. A major reason is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they don't want anything which looks a little bit like Soviet Union. They have to destroy all of it. Iraq, Syria, two of them. They looked a little bit like Syria. There was free education, like Russia. There were free health. So that has to be destroyed. So it's clear why they're fighting so much, why they're killing so many people. Because they want to control the world. Iran, Iraq, Syria, they all gas station. They want to jump to, don't let China and Russia to become again like a superpower. So we have to understand, we, the Arab, the Iranian, we should unite together and understand we're not enemy of each other. We should be united like a hell. We should not let anybody divide us. It is very, very important, comrades and friends. Syria is extremely important. There's a question why they couldn't destroy Syria for 2 years, spending millions of dollars. Why? For two reasons. China and Russia finally wake up. Finally. After what happened to Libya, after what happened to Iraq, they finally find out they have to resist, otherwise it's going to go after themselves. So that's one reason. The other reason is that the governments in Iran, in Syria, they should support the people, not one faction of the capitalists. They should give freedom to all the people, especially anti-imperialist people. This is another difference between Syria and other countries in the region, because Syria was aware that they should give democracy to the people. So in Iran we have the same problem. If Iran, rather than giving freedom to the communists, to socialists and working class, doesn't let the syndicates of the workers become free unions, finally they're going to be destroyed. They're going to be attacked and they're going to be defeated. Without freedom for the major people, who are the workers, peasants, and the middle class, and united them to defend the government, we're not able to resist. It's impossible to resist without people united. And also, without the American people consciousness, which Sara mentioned carefully, the media is manipulating these people, the working class. The strongest working class in the world is being manipulated by the media. Otherwise, there would be no war in the world. There would be no disaster like what happened in Syria and Iraq and the whole Middle East. Millions of people died. For what? If the working class was in power in the United States, this would happen. This would never happen. All the people of the world would be free. So it is so nice to hear that Syria is causing the anti-war movement in the United States to become united. As much as they resist the war peace, the war movement here, again, anti-war movement would be united more. These are the two major steps they have to resist and we have to unite in order to defend Syria and other nations. We are in an extremely dangerous situation. Iran would never give up on Syria. It's a red line for the Iranian people. Iranian will go there and fight. I'm sure about that. I'm sure when it comes to the point we go, all the Iranian, most of them are ready to go to fight to defend Syria. So it's a very, very, very dangerous situation. It's not Iraq, it's not Libya, it's a very dangerous. The Lebanese, the Palestinians, they all will unite. The whole Middle East is going to go up. It's a very, very dangerous situation. So I don't know, and Sara explained, the United States hasn't been winning anything in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya. Libya, the news doesn't say. In Libya, there's everyday resistance. Look at Turkey. What's going on in Turkey after interfering in Syria's affair, working like a, I can't say is what happened, the Turkish nation would not accept that from Erdogan, such a puppet of NATO. People have waked up. The Arab nation, the Turkish people, the Iranian people are not the ones who were like that before Iran revolution. Iran revolution has transferred the Middle East, to my opinion, to the new stage. And that's not going to happen. So it is extremely important that the people of Iraq, the people of Syria, the people of Iran, the people of Palestine should unite. They should love each other. There is no difference between Sunni and Shia, as sister explained. They lived together for years like nations in Soviet Union. They were living together so nicely. They were brothers and sisters. In Yugoslavia, U.S. imperialism wants China to be tiny to 60 nations. They don't want one China. They don't want Arab nation to be united. If they're united, they're going to leave. So it's extremely important that we have to be careful and understand who is the main enemy. The main enemy is U.S. imperialism. It's not even Israel. Even Israel is there in order to support the economic interests of the United States monopolies, because they're not Arab. So they can be in contradiction with the Arab nation. They even themselves, to my opinion, are puppet. So they just waiting. So I'm so sorry, Sara. So let's unite it and let's fight U.S. imperialism. We're gonna win this war. They're gonna lose it.
Thank you, Kazim. I got to tell you, it's tough being a chair at a meeting like this. This is really quite an incredible and spectacular, really voices from Syria, from Lebanon, from Palestine, from Iraq, from Iran, and all with actually very strongly one message.
Thank you for this marvelous program. It's been so informative and so inspiring. I have two questions. First of all, to the panel. We all know that Israel has been bombing Idlib in Syria. Is there any danger of them going into Lebanon at this point or in the very near future of dragging Lebanon into this terrible conflict? Secondly, I'd like to address my second question to Bill Dores. You briefly touched on the prospect of the United States risking war with Russia over Syria. Do you think that Russia will stand up and defy the United States? Putin has already thumbed his nose at us just a few days ago when asked about Edward Snowden, and he basically said, it's none of your business. Putin basically said, it's none of your business. What is your feeling on that? Do you think that Russia will stand up and defend their naval port at Tartus? Thank you.
Okay, other comments, questions? Ralph, I'm going to ask you to come up here.
No, I was going to ask a question.
Okay, let's hand you the mic.
I was going to ask a question contrary to my usual position. And the questions are this, and I am so glad we had the last speaker because he made projections. As it was obvious to project in struggles in the Far East, it's obvious to project struggles in Afghanistan, and I hear a projection, I'd like to hear the projection of the missteps, the mistakes, the problems involved in American support of proxies in the Middle East. And I get everyone in this room knows what I'm referring to is the beginning support of Hamas, the beginning support of Hezbollah, the beginning support was not to be what they are today. And so would you project on what America is doing and where it possibly will end up? Any of the speakers?
It's just so frustrating to hear in the media that whenever they get ready to have a war, they always frame it as, this is the democratic United States fighting against this dictatorship. They always do that. But look what happened in Boston during the Boston bombing. There was one bombing, and they shut the city down. And you can bet that there wasn't going to be any protests going on in Boston that night. There wasn't even traffic that night because one bombing happened. How many bombings have there been in Syria lately? How many innocent people have been killed? How much have they done? And yet, you know, Assad's a dictator for not letting those forces organize openly. You know, it's so hypocritical because we all know that freedom in any society is relative to the safety of a regime. The reason we're able to have protests, the reason we're able to even have this meeting tonight is because they know that we're not a threat to them at this point. There's no way we can overthrow them. But if we were at a point where we could overthrow them, they would outlaw meetings like this. And that's the way it is in any society. Freedom of speech is proportional to the safety of a regime. And when you see these videos of what these Syrian rebels have done, taking 10-year-old children and forcing them to cut off the heads of adults, I mean, that's disgusting. And if Assad, by limiting these people's ability to pass out leaflets, is able to prevent these people from coming in and destabilizing and overthrowing Syria, I don't have an issue with that. I really don't. It's not about democracy and dictatorship. It's about imperialism and anti-imperialism. And democracy, until we get to a society without classes, we're never going to have any kind of democracy. It's going to be the rule of the imperialists or the rule of people fighting imperialism, and that's what it's going to be. So that's just my 2 cents. So thank you.
A couple of questions I think were directed at me. I think that the leadership of the Lebanese resistance of Hezbollah feels very strongly that if Syria were to be overthrown, then Israel would definitely come into South Lebanon, and that's why invade Lebanon, and that's why they felt it so necessary to come to the assistance of the Syrian Arab Army. I mean, right now the sectarian war is being brought to Lebanon courtesy of the March 14th movement and the CIA, and this is Israel and these characters are two arms of the same coin. When Israel invaded Lebanon in 2006, the head of the internal security forces said, if Israeli soldiers show up at their base, offer them tea. I can't tell you what Vladimir Putin or the Russian leadership is going to do. But I hope that they understand, and I think Putin, he was in the KGB, I think he understands what the U.S. game is, and that Russia's on the list. The surrender of the Soviet Union, which I think was a tragedy, did not satisfy the U.S.'s appetite. They didn't wage a multi-trillion-dollar Cold War to get an economic rival. They wage it to destroy, to conquer. Imperialism is a system. It's not just greed. It's a system that has certain laws that it must obey, and one of those laws is expand or die. And so with the tragic situation that the sister described from Iraq, this was the biggest bonanza the U.S. oil companies ever had. Now, back in the 1880s, when the oil trusts were being set up, when John D. Rockefeller organized the Standard Oil of Ohio, they had to strangle all the small producers, in order to set up a monopoly. And the Iraq War is on a world scale the same thing. It's what they have to do. It's what monopolies have to do, and that's why we have to smash their power.
5 cents.
Dr. Moussa.
All right, thank you. I just want to thank everybody for being here and for allowing us to be among you, wonderful group of people. But to answer a few of the questions and just to make a comment about what happened after we spoke, I don't think at this critical moment and people being killed left and right and everybody is dying of hunger, it's not the time that we're going to be able to point finger that this regime did this and somebody was arrested and somebody was not arrested. I overwhelmingly disagree with that statement, but nevertheless, everybody has his opinion. But for us as a group of people to answer off, where are we going to go from here? I think the people will succeed in getting whatever they need to get. Now, if we're going to be getting the obstacles of big powers and people are going to bomb us and people are going to die of hunger, but still somebody is going to be born out of the ashes and they will raise and they will get whatever they want. And this is what everybody should believe in. And this is a fact. History teaches us that if you have the right and you keep standing behind your right, you will succeed. And this is what's going to happen. Would the Israelis move in? Yes, they could. The Turks stayed in Syria 400 years, but we were able to kick them out. The Israelis are there only for 70 years. We'll be able to kick them out. It's not going to continue like this.
Well, there are contradictions in the Assad regime. But the Assad regime is the group that's fighting against the imperialist onslaught. And they need to be supported in this, against imperialism, against dismemberment of the country. This is the issue now. There are also popular militias now that are fighting side by side with the Syrian military. And I just want to mention one because it's the Communist Party, which has disagreements with the government, particularly on the neoliberal policy. And they say that. We disagree with you on the neoliberal policy. We wish you would change it. But we're going to put our bodies on the line to defend the Syrian nation right here and now. And we need to respect this. And we need to be totally in support of the Assad government, unconditionally against imperialism. That's what is needed right now, militantly and with full spirit. Hezbollah is a very interesting entity in the Middle East because it's the only group that has ever defeated Israel. And twice. A small group of maybe 1 million or 2 million people taking the lessons of JAP, of People's War, with a good, strong leadership, the party of God. And through guerrilla warfare, they kicked out the Israeli occupiers of the south after 10 years of occupation. And in the 2006 invasion, the Israelis did not pass. They could not keep any territory in Lebanon. No matter the superiority of their weapons, they could not do it. And Israel is never going to forget this and is always looking to find some way to work against Hezbollah, to destroy it if possible, and feels a certain entitlement to Lebanon. I mean, let's face it, there's no borders in Israel. It's an expansionist state, has never had any defined borders. But I think Hezbollah is quite aware of this, and it really is exemplary in the way it's been working so far. And of course, the alliance with Iraq and with Syria is very important to its existence. But the forces are always at each other, Israel and Hezbollah, always. That's a front line for Hezbollah. And I just think that the business about the soap operas is very interesting and very important. Because we're talking about who's going to write the historical narrative of the Middle East. Now, we know what the U.S. historical narrative is. Those people over there, they hate each other. They've been killing each other for thousands of years. There's nothing you can do about it. We're trying to bring democracy to them. That's one narrative. And the imperialists, it's the white man's burden. The imperialists want to keep that as the narrative. There's another narrative, the Gulf states and have a narrative that their beneficence brings peace and harmony to the land. But this is the Arab national narrative, which it is that the Syrian soap operas have. You may disagree, maybe it's broad, it's a soap opera, but it's the unity of the people of the Middle East in pride and in custom, and it really came together against imperialism in the modern era. So it's not just about soap operas, it's not just about boycotting, it's about who's going to write the history of the period.
Well, thank you to this panel tonight. I'm going to end by saying this is not the world of 100 years ago. And the ability of outside big powers, big corporate power, to decide the fate of peoples is no longer an option. That's really what's at stake. And it does not mean any one of these governments are perfect. They got big problems of their own, of course. But they have a right to decide. They have the right. The people of Syria have the right to decide. And we gotta admit that those who rule here in the U.S. are war criminals. That's important to even say right here. Now, in ending, I'm going to just to say, you see these demands right here. There's a very important statement that's been put out by major anti-war coalitions. They may be small in number, but the United National Anti-War Coalition, United for Peace and Justice, the Answer Coalition, have together signed a statement, a united call for actions to oppose U.S., NATO, Israeli war on Syria, to say no more wars, U.S. out of the Middle East. There's more than 50 sponsoring groups. They've called for national days of action across the country from June 28th to July 17th. The demands are stop U.S., NATO, Israeli war and all forms of intervention against Syria, self-determination free from outside intervention for the Syrian people, fund people's needs, not the military, and U.S. out of the Middle East. So here in New York, across the country, we want to talk about what kind of coordinated actions we can organize together. The statement is important. The number of groups who've signed on is important. We got to, though, put the feet on the ground. So it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge to go from the importance of a unified statement. And that was a struggle. That was a struggle, an important political struggle. Now it's the mobilizing struggle that is also important. In closing, I also want to remind everyone that this coming Monday, we're going to be out at Foley Square for Lynn Stewart. We got to defend our own political prisoners, those who have sacrificed, continue to demand freedom for Lynn Stewart, her release. We need to, the same thing with all our political prisoners, from Mumia Abu Jamal to all those in prison, largest prison population in the world, and these issues are so linked. So thank you everyone who's come, and stay strong.